don't know if you want them handed out. Oops, I'm hot. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for your patience. We were getting different messages on when we were actually supposed to start this session and also when we're supposed to end it. So we're going to start it now, and we will have about an hour. So with that in mind, my name is Julie Shapiro. I'm the Natural Resources Center Director at Keystone Policy Center, which is a nonprofit, non-advocacy organization dedicated to helping people of very different perspectives reach common higher ground on tough issues, including in agriculture and in genetic technologies. So I'm joined today by 4 fabulous panelists who could really run this panel by themselves, but they've agreed to let me moderate. So I'll take up that charge. And we're here to discuss securing societal benefits from gene editing. This morning, from the main stage, we heard Samantha Power talk about the power of CRISPR and gene editing tools in the context of a broader dialogue on what we're growing, how we're growing things, and who's benefiting. And those were some of the key themes of her discussion today. So really focusing on, beyond just regulation, the questions that guide and govern how technologies are brought into our food systems context to address big challenges that we keep hearing about: food security, nutrition security, climate, health, sustainability. So those are the kinds of challenges we're going to bear in mind in this panel today as we think about the potential for gene editing to address these kinds of challenges, and we think about what needs to be in place to guide how decisions are made on these technologies, and who they're made by, and who they're made with. We're going to explore the opportunities that gene editing brings in terms of examples of applications and traits for the technology. And we're also going to talk specifically about the roles of societal engagement, of transparency, of access, and diversification of research and development efforts. We hope that all of us collectively will gain some new insights, not only into how products made with these techniques could help achieve development goals, but also what steps are going to be needed to obtain the necessary social license so that societal benefits of the products will be realized. We also heard Samantha Power from the stage today talk about unintended consequences of the Green Revolution, and so we're also going to be thinking about how do we learn from past experiences with genomic technologies as we look to a future where technology can hopefully bring us benefits to tackle big challenges. So that's our charge in 1 hour, and I thank the organizers for the opportunity and for the World Food Prize staff for the opportunity to be here today. I'm going to kick us off with a round of introductions in which I'll ask the panelists to say who they are and also what brings them to this discussion. Why are you here to talk about gene editing? What's your interest, and how do you orient your own perspectives towards that topic? I'm going to start with Greg Jaffe, who is our session host from Center for Science and the Public Interest.
So thank you, Julie, and welcome, and thank you all for attending today, this afternoon. I'm the Senior Director at the Center for Science and Public Interest, focusing on biotechnology and other innovative food technologies and products, as well as issues around sustainability and climate change. For those of you who don't know, as Julie said, CSPI is sponsoring this breakout session today, and we are a food and nutrition consumer organization located in Washington, D.C. We've been around now for more than 50 years, educating consumers and advocating on their behalf for policies and products that are safe and nutritious. We work on issues like reducing salt and sugar in the diet, ensuring informative food labeling, policies that ensure that our food supply is safe and more nutritious. So why am I here and why are we involved in biotechnologies? I mean, I think at CSPI we believe that biotechnologies, whether genetic engineering or gene editing, can produce safe products and provide societal benefits, such as products that are safer, more nutritious, that reduce the environmental footprint of agriculture and food products. But to see those products get to the marketplace, we need good governance, I think, as Julie said. The products must not only be developed, but they also must be adopted in the marketplace. And I think we'll spend a lot of time today talking about that. How do we get them to be accepted in the marketplace? We sponsored this session really as an opportunity to dialogue with a broad range of stakeholders that have the same overall goal: societal utilization of gene editing to develop products. I think we believe that bringing different stakeholders together, we can develop a roadmap of the key issues that need to be addressed on that road to a successful product adoption. I think of today's dialogue today, and I hope all of you will get a chance to have questions as an opening for a discussion, and we'll talk a little bit about a paper a little later that I was a co-author on. But I think of this as working together as different stakeholders to take advantage of gene editing for societal benefits. And so I hope that those of you who are interested after this panel will come to me or others on the panel and get involved in that dialogue, both people in person here or virtually.
Great, thank you, Greg. Jack.
Thank you. My name is Jack Bobo. I'm the Director of Global Food and Water Policy at the Nature Conservancy. For those who don't know, the Nature Conservancy is the world's largest conservation organization, been around since 1951, operating in 76 countries around the world. A little bit of my background beyond that, though, I have worked for a biotechnology company as head of communications and global policy. I spent 13 years at the U.S. Department of State working on global food policy. So these are issues that are sort of near and dear to my heart. Just as Greg represents the consumer policy, I guess I'm representing the conservation community here. And to that question, why is a conservation organization here talking about gene editing? I think that there are a few reasons. I think it was alluded to earlier, but when I think about it, in many ways, there's just nothing that has a bigger, more negative impact on the planet than agriculture, and yet there's nothing more critical for our daily survival. So the challenge that we all have is how to maintain and grow the benefits and reduce those negatives. And to that effect, we think innovation and technology has an important role to play. If we were farming today with 1960s technology, we would need 1 billion additional hectares of land, and that's more than a quarter of all the forests on the planet. And so what we're interested in is ensuring that there are appropriate, science-based, predictable, transparent regulations that are in place to ensure the safety of the products for people and the planet, and that the benefits of those technologies then are available for people to use them. So we're not advocating for any particular technology. But just one example of where the Nature Conservancy has come out in favor of one of these genetic technologies relates to the American chestnut, the genetically engineered American chestnut. The chestnut was basically wiped out from all of North America from disease. It was one of the most common trees in America, no longer really exists in the wild. And the only way to bring it back was through this tree. And as an organization, what we did was we asked, well, what is the science behind it? We held listening sessions of people inside our organization. We held webinars. We reached out to outside experts. And we went through a process to determine whether or not, in good conscience, could we advocate in favor of that. And at the end of that evaluation, we did submit a statement in support of the GE chestnut. And so, that's a little bit of how we're thinking about this, is how can we contribute to ensure that these products are safe in terms of the conservation, but also available as conservation tools. So in addition to the food things that we're talking about, we're thinking of island eradication of pests and invasive species and all sorts of other challenges that these technologies could be used for beyond the topic of food that we're talking about here today. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jack. We'll come back to discussion of additional applications in a little more depth in a moment. Let me go to Sarah.
Great. Thanks, Julie. Great to be part of this panel on a really important topic. I'm Sarah Evanja. I'm trained as a plant molecular biologist, but have spent most of the past decade communicating about the importance of ensuring access to biotechnologies. And today I serve as lead for stakeholder communication at Pairwise. And Pairwise is a food and tech startup using CRISPR to innovate in produce. We're a mission-driven company that's committed to really building a healthier world through better fruits and vegetables. And in fact, we hosted a session earlier today on the importance of investing in nutrition. So it may or may not come as a surprise to you that fewer than 1 in 10 American adults consumes the recommended daily amount of fruits and vegetables every day. And this has led to a real uptick in dietary diseases, which is now a leading cause of death. So at Pairwise, we're using technology, CRISPR in particular, to essentially reduce the barriers that prevent people from consuming and enjoying more fruits and vegetables. And next year, I'm pleased to say, we'll be launching what we believe will be the first branded, gene-edited, whole food produce that will appear in US supermarkets, and this will come out under our consumer-facing brand, Conscious Foods. We've been, talking for a long time about the need to use biotechnology to deliver benefits to consumers, and our company is really built on this notion of the importance of delivering benefits to consumers and responding to their preferences in produce. As a leader in food tech and produce, we're also committed to leading the way in providing consumers with transparent, useful information that about our products, how they're developed, how they're produced, so that consumers can make really informed decisions about what they want to purchase and what they want to feed their families. So I'm pleased to be here and to share more on how we're delivering on that commitment. Thanks.
Okay. I look forward to eating some salad soon, especially if it's yours. So I'm Neil Gutterson. I'm a plant molecular biologist, geneticist, biochemist by training, and I'm here wearing my main hat, which is as a partner in CTO at Radical Growth. We're an early stage sustainable ag and food venture company that focuses on developing companies, company formation, company development. But I really come to the conversation with sort of 3 hats. That was my primary hat. I'm going to look at this conversation from the standpoint of an investor. What makes it possible for this technology to lead to products in the marketplace, like Sarah talked about, that are important to consumers, important to farmers, and create value, in the world. So that's an investor perspective. But I also was the CTO at Corteva for a few years, and that capacity championed really the use of genome editing and the equitable licensing of IP, actually in a partnership that we had with the Broad Institute, to make the foundational IP for genome editing, CRISPR-Cas9, available to essentially anyone who wanted to use it in agriculture. And we felt that the ability for all parties to use the technology would be very good for the industry overall. So that was a second hat of the large company. And then the third hat, I'm also on the system board for the CGIAR. And I believe very strongly, and I was co-authoring a paper earlier this year with some CGIAR colleagues, about the benefits that could accrue to smallholder farmers if this technology is well used in the marketplace and responsibly used and put in the right direction to solve the right kind of problems. We could bring benefits to smallholder farmers much faster and different and maybe better benefits than otherwise we can with conventional breeding, which is still a powerful technology. So those are the 3 hats I bring. I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity across a wide range of crops. I think the technology is relatively, it's not simple to use. I think it isn't, you used to hear about it, it's your back, it's your garage, you can just do some editing. It's not like that in agriculture, but it is a technology that can be used pretty broadly and should be.
Great, thanks, Neil. So in those opening comments, we heard about benefits potentially for nutrition, for conservation, for productivity, for a consumer appeal. And that sounds great. I want to drill down just a little more on what you think is coming soon, what you're most excited about for applications and traits. And I want to frame that with kind of the devil's advocate question, which is, one of the big criticisms in the past of genomic technologies and genetic engineering was lots of promise, very little delivery in terms of what you saw coming to market and what the benefits were, or at least what the perceived benefits were from the broader society. So tell us a little more, Jack, what are those benefits of the chestnut tree? Let's start with you and others. Think about a really concrete example, something you think is actually going to come soon and make a difference.
Yeah, so I think, just sticking with the American chestnut tree, I mean, it's hard for us to even imagine today what the United States or North America look like if the entire continent were covered with these chestnut trees and the biodiversity that relied upon these products or these trees and the ecosystems that were disrupted. And so, it's all disappeared. And so, there's an opportunity to begin to restore some of our natural environment. And, from a conservation perspective, that's very exciting. And so I think that there are similar opportunities, and I'm just going to talk about the conservation world because others can speak to food. But, today many people don't understand what it takes to try to eradicate an invasive species from an island. And, I just came from New Zealand. I was there yesterday. And, they basically carpet bomb with poison. They're just dropping poison by planes to try to kill, whether it's mice or rabbits or whatever it might be. And, they want to kill the pests and do as little harm to the natural environment as they can. But it's pretty bad. And often it still doesn't work. And so I think many people think that some of these technologies, it's moving too fast. And I think often these are technologies of last resort. If there was an easier way to do it, if there was a non-genetic approach or tool, most would probably take that path just because the regulatory burden is so much lighter. And so, I think, we'll probably talk later about why some of these older technologies haven't done it. But, for me, it really comes back to that regulatory barriers that, it costs so much to bring a product to market that small companies have gone out of business waiting for those opportunities to happen. And I could give the example of the challenges that AquaBounty and Oxitec and others have faced from a regulatory perspective when we get there in the conversation.
Great, hold that thought. Thanks, Doug. Neil, let me ask you about a specific application. You're focused on, smallholders. You talked earlier today over lunch about inclusivity. So tell me something that's going to make a difference for those audiences.
Sure. I mean, in that paper I mentioned, we actually had a whole list of the sort of products that were in the pipeline for the CGR across all the centers, and there's some interesting ones. A lot of them are about the farm level, right? And you talked about why we didn't get more benefits from GMOs, and there's probably a whole panel to be held on that one. But one of the reasons was the complexity of regulatory, right? That prevented things from getting to the market. And also the fact that, at least in North America, there are very few farmers compared to the whole population. But if you're in Kenya and you've got a problem with a maize disease that is catastrophic for growers, like maize lethal necrosis virus, that's a societal problem. And so I think you actually have a problem that's farm level, resistance to MLN, and that is meaningful to the entire society. So that's the kind of thing I think that can make a huge impact in the developing world. And interesting enough, the original allele for MLN, this is a naturally occurring allele, came out of the gene bank in CIMMYT, and for maize, out of a Colombian variety. But it takes a while to breed something in that's resistant. And usually when you bring something from very diverse genetics into an elite variety that's working in Kenya, you compromise the performance of the variety. So what can genome editing do? It can give you resistance in a high-performing elite variety, which is great for the marketplace, great for the consumer. That's just an example. I mean, I love the consumer side. I think consumer pull is so vital, and talking about benefits and not just risks is really critical. But that's an example for me. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Neil. To keep us moving, I'm going to go on to our next question and let folks hold their thoughts on other examples to weave in to our discussion going forward. We're framing this conversation in part around governance, and regulation is a piece of that. But I think we're all here with the premise, at least from the panel, that regulation is necessary but not sufficient in terms of achieving societal benefits and societal license. So I want to turn to Greg. He mentioned a paper that he and others had written regarding principles for governance. So Greg, tee us up. What do you see as critical components for achieving benefits and also minimizing risks?
Okay, so let me give a little background. So my organization, the Center for Science Public Interest, Jack's organization, the Nature Conservancy, and 4 other environmental and food safety and food and nutrition NGOs got together and sort of said, we believe that gene editing can help. It can be a benefit. It can help solve the conservation issues, the nutrition issues. My organization, the different mandates that our different organizations had, but how do we not make the same mistakes we made with GMOs? How do we get those products to market and get the necessary social license, get that governance? And so with the help of Julie as a moderator facilitator, we all worked together for about a year and put together what we thought were 6 principles around that. And we ended up publishing an article in Nature Biotech in September 2021. If anyone wants a copy of it, let me know afterwards. I'm happy to give it to people. Where we sort of looked at that and said, how do we achieve these benefits? And what would be the, what are the principles, what needs to be addressed? And so what I thought I would do is just quickly go through those principles, because I think we can then have some discussion about them in our discussion about how do we get these products to market. We didn't put a hierarchy on the principles. They were sort of just 6 equal principles here. So I'm going to talk to them in a specific order they were published in, but it doesn't mean that one is more important than the other. Our view is that they all were. And so the first one was to avoid risk and deliver tangible societal benefits. And I think we've already started that discussion here, that there could be a broad range of benefits, including ecological, social, and climate resilience, biological diversity, natural resources, economic, rural development, cultural values, food sovereignty, a host of different things, and that we should try to use this technology for some of those things, some of which might not necessarily come from the private sector. The second principle was having a robust societal engagement. And I think we've heard about that a lot in the last day and a half here for people who have been to the sessions. Our view is that we could get better societal outcomes and more beneficial products if developers and scientists engaged with and incorporate input from a broad range of stakeholders, especially early in the development process. So we can develop products that are win-win, that achieve what farmers want, but also achieve what consumers want at the same time, would be an example. Our third one was effective science-based government regulation. I think Jack has already mentioned that. We need to manage the risks to humans and the environment, but we should do that in a science-based, predictable fashion. We specifically talked about having proportionate review, that not everything is reviewed the same, but that it be transparent and, again, efficient. I think many of the regulatory systems that are out there aren't efficient, and that's one of the major problems. The fourth one was that there should be voluntary stewardship. We talked about the idea of a product assessment, the idea that there are other issues out there, such as economics, trade, coexistence, and these products have to come into those markets, and that there should be an analysis of that and working with stakeholders to address those. And voluntary stewardship, I think, especially comes into play if these products some of them aren't going to be regulated, then the public and others are going to want to see that there is some stewardship along with them. The fifth one was transparency, which we've talked about a lot in the last day and a half here, but our view is that was critical to fostering trust and understanding of the technology. It allows for monitoring of it, for different stakeholders to discuss how to minimize disruptions from an international product. And we talked about how you might achieve that, and we may get into that later about a national registry or other ways that we can do that. And finally, we did talk about a sixth principle, which I think Neil has already mentioned, inclusive access to the technology, that we needed both public investment in this, but also access, that this technology should not go the route of some other technologies where they've really been wound up in their IP and hard to be used on a broad societal basis. So I think those were the 6 that we talked about, and we felt that looking at those and identifying those would be a way to begin to get that social license that's needed, I think, to bring these to market.
Thanks, Greg. Okay, so 6 principles. That gives us about 3 minutes each. No, just kidding. We're going to cover a couple of them here, and again, I hope folks accept the offer to come dialogue with us afterwards as well. Regulation, actually, we're not going to do as much of a deep dive in. Again, necessary, probably not sufficient. And some of the rationale, I think we already heard from Neil and Jack a little bit here too. It's regulation is really important in terms of setting the rules for who gets to play or is able to play, and what makes it to market. And we know that's critical. But let's take on some of these other questions as well. Let's assume that you have regulatory approval. What's still going to be needed to actually achieve benefits, or even to prioritize which benefits you need to achieve in the first place? That's where I want to dive in. So let's talk about the role of engagement and transparency. I want to go to Sarah first. what's the difference between transparency and engagement, and tell us more about how you see each playing out in terms of governance for gene editing.
Great. So again, pairwise, we're going to be among the first to put a gene-edited product out into U.S. supermarket shelves. This is a nutrient-dense green that has real health benefits just next year in 2023. So it's a really exciting year up ahead for us. Further down the pipeline, we have other products that respond to consumer demand. Berries that don't have seeds, that are flavorful, that also confer benefits to the people who pick the berries by being thornless. So the thread that sort of goes through our product pipeline is that we're responding to what we hear consumers want improved in their produce. And so as a sort of a leader going out there, being among the first to be first, we also really want to be mindful of the importance of being transparent with consumers so that they can make informed decisions about what they purchase and what they feed their families. So we're very proud of the products that we're developing and the fact that they're developed using CRISPR. We also know from our own research, as well as the research of many others, that consumers don't know very much about gene editing and CRISPR. And yet, when you start to tell them what it can do, they're really hungry to learn more. And so one thing that we've done is on our Conscious Foods website, we've made a lot of information available about what CRISPR is, how our products have been developed using CRISPR. Do you want to learn more? Here's Gene Editing 101. So there's definitely a lot of educational resource there on the website. We also offer a very clear view into our work for a range of different stakeholders. So if you're someone who likes to go to the peer-reviewed literature, we just a month ago published the very nitty-gritty details of how we developed our greens in an open access journal. So that information is there for folks to access. We're also really transparent about the fact that we use CRISPR to innovate in produce in all of our media interviews. Our CEO is sitting here in the second row. And the media are really interested in CRISPR and how it's being applied. And in all the interviews that Tom and others in the leadership team do, we're very clear that we're using CRISPR. So certainly nothing to hide there. I think the most important display of transparency is when these products show up on supermarket shelves next year. There will be language on the pack that tells the story of conscious greens and that mentions the words, CRISPR or gene editing, so that consumers can really, make informed choices. Not only will we have those words on the pack, but there probably will also be some sort of scannable label so that consumers can, scan that label and then, go back to that Conscious Food website and learn more about CRISPR and gene editing. So I think this is the ultimate display of transparency, putting the words on the pack. There's no more useful way to be clear to consumers. But in terms of engagement, we're out there engaging with people today in advance of that product launch. So we spent July, August, and September sort of hitting the streets in cities like Seattle, the Bay Area, and Austin, Texas, engaging people meeting people where they are at arts festivals, music festivals, street festivals, and offering them a taste of our salads. We offered salads to about 6,000, well, probably more than 6,000 people, but 6,000 people responded to our surveys. And there was clear signage about the technology that we use to develop our greens. And of those 6,000 surveys, fewer than 1% of the respondents even brought up the issue of CRISPR or gene editing. And if you drill down and look at that 1%, over half of the comments that were made about gene editing were actually positive. So we think that people are excited about the role that CRISPR can play or food tech in general can play in helping make more nutritious foods and foods that will have some sort of environmental benefit as well as a personal health benefit. So those are some of the ways that we're engaging with people and also making sure that people can make informed choices.
Great, thanks, Sarah. We'll talk more about transparency, and all of these are interwoven. I want to focus on engagement for a moment. You were really talking about examples of engagement kind of a little further downstream. You've got a product coming to market. So I also want to bring in voices of what does engagement maybe look at like throughout cycles of development, all the way from how you frame the problem through as you're developing the product and then product launch. So we're kind of working backwards here. But let me go to Neil. Neil, you're an investor. So,
Right.
And you're also working, as you mentioned, with the CGIAR1 board and, thinking about those earlier decisions around what are we even spending our money and time into researching. How do you think about engagement in that context?
Right. Well, let me start with the transparency piece just a little bit, because I think I really applaud the things that Pairwise is doing. When I was at Corteva, very early on, we launched also sort of information-based websites to provide people with information. And I think the key we always thought about was building trust, and transparency is a tool for trust. I think sometimes people don't even look at what's out there as information, but if you make it available, it's accessible. That's a powerful statement that you're confident in the technology, information's available, you can be trusted, you'll put that information out. So I think that's critical. Now, technology adoption has its cycles, right? There's early, mid, late stages. At this stage, I think we probably need to over-communicate about the products that are coming, both the benefits and other potential issues. I think from a comparative standpoint to conventional breeding versus this technology in applications that I focus on, which are sort of relatively simple applications of modifying a genome with small edits or deletions, you get the same kind of products you get from conventional breeding. And so I see the risks as very limited, but we can communicate about that and why. And I think the comparison of the new technology to existing ones is a really important frame of reference. I think that's important from an investment standpoint. I think interesting, I'll just make an observation from an investment standpoint. It's a little different here, but we don't see a lot of companies, actually small companies yet. We haven't invested in one at Radical. And I think there's, the landscape is still a little uncertain, and uncertainty is the enemy of an investor. And so the more we get the market comfortable, see some products come to the market. There's the Heart Healthy Tomato in Japan. I think the CGIAR, we talk about trust, is a broadly very trusted organization and set of institutions. And so when they bring products to smallholder farmers, there's a long-standing engagement process with those farmers and the local countries about technology. Each country has its own issues from a regulatory standpoint, but I think actually the CGIAR is in a very good position to be a trusted partner and point the technology to really important problems and be very transparent about that. So both an investor and a CG perspective for you, yeah.
Great. Thanks. I'm going to go to Jack and then Greg. Jack, I'm going to ask you to start by just responding to this question of engagement. You talked about how TNC engaged its own stakeholders in making a decision about supporting the GE chestnut. Can you say more about what kind of engagement you would look for or hope for in terms of people coming to the conservation community for insight and input?
Yeah, so one of the things that I'm working on internally in TNC right now is to develop a standard guideline for how we approach these questions so that we have really a decision tree that says when a new product comes out and somebody says, well, what is an organization, do you think about it? Then we know how to approach that question. And the approach that I'm looking at is based on the organization's core values. And our core values are stakeholder engagement, science-based approaches, diversity and inclusiveness. And so we want to make sure that our process reflects our values. And we do that by engaging with internal stakeholders, external stakeholders, and partners to understand what do they know about this issue, what are they thinking about it. To engage with scientists internally. We have thousands of scientists that work for the organization, and we want to rely on that expertise, but also to go out and speak to independent scientists to understand the risks and the benefits of any of the new technology, and then to look at its applications and see whether or not there's a benefit that is worth it. And as I mentioned before, many of these technologies, there is a question of consumer acceptance, there's a question of regulatory approval, and so it's probably not going to be the first technology that we as an organization would recommend. We're probably going to say, well, could this be done through conventional breeding? If the answer is yes, then it might be, well, could it be done in a time frame that's relevant? And if the answer is also yes, well then, we might encourage them to go down that road. But if, as Neil said, that maybe you could do it through conventional breeding, but it's going to take 20 years because of the number of back crosses and other things to need to do. Well, the challenges we face are pretty eminent. 40% of all the land on Earth is currently devoted to agriculture. 70% of all fresh water goes to agriculture. 30% of greenhouse gas emissions are either directly from agriculture or indirectly from deforestation, 80% of which is caused by agriculture. And so, these are the sort of the realities of today. And so, we really want to be able to make significant progress towards our, 2030 goals. And that requires doing things better and faster than we've done them in the past. And there is a role for this. And so if we get through that process and if we've engaged, then I think we'll feel comfortable, either recommending that as an organization we support it, and that's going to be a transparent process, that people are going to be able to see it, they'll understand what kind of engagement we've done, and that it's a thoughtful process. I mean, people may or may not agree with the outcome, but I think that it's important that they actually understand, that there was a process that one went through and it's really related to an organization's values.
Thanks, Jack. So all three of you have made comments kind of oriented towards the importance of understanding the demands and of the end users, whether it's the farmers or the conservation community or the consumer. So demand-driven and also value-aligned is kind of, I think, what your comment was there, Jack. Greg, I'd like you to comment a little more on engagement, and then we're going to talk a little more about transparency mechanisms like registries. But first, engagement, and you've been engaging for a long time on behalf of CSPI in these conversations. So what does good engagement look like to you? Why is it important to achieve societal benefit?
So I think, I take some of where I come at this issue from sort of mistakes made in previous technologies. And, when the first genetically modified crops came out there, the engagement, I think, was primarily to the farmer, the person who was going to grow that. And that was the market, and that was good for those. But there's a whole chain that goes along with that. And the rest of the food chain, up and including consumers, wasn't engaged, and there wasn't transparency about that. And I think that you have to build trust, as others have said. And if you don't, and if the information's out there, I think many people will not look at that information. But if it's hidden from them, then they begin to really worry about that information. And so, from my point of view, the engagement really needs to be throughout the food chain and letting people know and trying to be able to figure out how to coexist. The marketplace is going to hopefully support these, but it will support organic, it will support other forms of agriculture at the same time. And so you have to bring all those stakeholders in, and so they're aware of the technology, and so that they can adapt to that technology. So that stakeholder engagement sort of at the far end. Personally, I think if you do stakeholder engagement at the early end, when you're developing, we can get better win-win products. So, when thinking about a product that, a product that might be developed by a scientist, they may try to solve a problem that a farmer has, a problem with climate change, for example, but can we get two for the price of one? Can they also at the same time solve a nutrition problem and deal with that? And I think, or solve a conservation problem at the same time. And I think if we have stakeholder engagement early on, then you get support for those products much earlier, because those different stakeholders, whether they're conservation or nutrition groups like mine, are engaged early on. Then they want to see that product succeed because they've been involved from the beginning in conceiving of that product. So to me, I think that we can get win-win situations.
Yeah, and just to build on that, I mean, if something like a BT corn in a place like Kenya, a company might try to sell that product by talking about its benefits to the farmer. But if they engage with the conservation community, they might talk about a reduction in pesticides. And if they engage with the consumer or public facing, they might talk about reductions in mycotoxins that has a public health benefit. And so by engaging with those stakeholders, you have actually a broader range of organizations that care about the topic that might be able to weigh in.
Great. We'll hold you on registry for just a minute. Kind of come back to Sarah one more time. You look on the cusp of saying something. And I also wanted to ask, having come full circle, you were talking earlier about engaging consumers and demand, but you also mentioned thornless berries, right? And you're thinking about farm workers in that case. So I was wondering, could you say a little more about how you prioritize and conceptualize, both the stakeholders that you want to serve, and also how do you prioritize engagement to inform your own decisions about what products you're pursuing?
Yeah, I appreciate that because, to Greg's comment about, there should be win-wins, right? I think our BlackBerry work is a real example of a win-win where, we started the work really focused on consumers and asking consumers, what would drive you to consume more of this very nutritious food, right? That's snackable and has, sort of high nutrition. And when we talk to consumers, they say, well, we don't really like the taste of blackberries. And even more than that, we really don't like the seeds, right? So those are the clear barriers to why consumers aren't choosing to consume more berries, more blackberries in this case. And so, we're using the tools of CRISPR and gene editing. We're starting with a really great tasting berry. It's large and good tasting. It's great germplasm to start with. And then editing it for seedlessness to address that consumer trait, but also editing it to be thornless. And so that has benefits for the producers, right, who are, want these berries picked, and they want to pick fast, and they want all the berries to be picked. And it also, of course, has benefits for the people who are actually doing the picking, right? A thornless berry is much more appealing to work with than one with thorns. And then I'll share that we're also working on a berry that will be higher yielding. And of course, whenever you can drive up yields, there's major environmental benefits. And so this will be also much more environmentally sustainable, and that we're going to be able to grow more with fewer inputs. So it's a win-win-win-win.
Thanks, Sarah. So we talked about engagement, of the feedback loop of how you drive decisions in product development and how you also communicate information out about products. Let's talk more about transparency, not from the lens specifically of, well, maybe partially from the lens of letting anyone who wants to know what's in the products, but also let's talk about transparency in terms of larger food systems and markets. Greg, you mentioned a registry. Can you say more about that and tell us more about how that supports good governance and societal benefits?
So one of the things I have advocated for was some sort of national registry where all of the different gene-edited products would be identified out there for anybody who wanted that information. And that has been a controversial thing. And I appreciate Sarah and Pairwise saying that they're going to put on the package that their products are gene-edited. I don't think that's the case with all the companies that may produce gene-edited foods. And I'm not advocating here necessarily that we should have mandatory labeling of that either at the same time. But I do think that information needs to be out there. And I mentioned before that, I think consumers get worried if information is hidden from them. They may not want to access the information, but knowing it there gives them confidence and trust. But if they go to look for information and it's not there, then they wonder, why is it not there? And so the label is one place to put it, but I don't expect that every company is going to put it on the label. And I also take a practical look at this. I mean, we have a food system out there, and while everybody here on the panel thinks that there will be societal benefits from this technology, there are some people who do not want this technology, whether that's the organic community, whether that's the non-GMO community, whether that's certain countries, they don't want this. And so, if you're developing the product, you don't want to make enemies. You don't want to make people in the food chain make choices. Do I stick with organic or the organic people who I have a relationship with, or do I put the gene-edited products in there? So I think, if we want to have markets that have choice in them, that we deal with international trade and other things, this information needs to be out there, and it needs to be in a form that's easily gotten by anybody in that food chain, whether that's a grain handler, whether that's a retailer, that they can provide it. And so having it on individual websites is good, but if you're Wegmans or Walmart, you can't go to every gene editing company out there and look on their websites to figure out what products are commercialized. There has to be some central location you can go there. And if you're Wegmans or Walmart and a consumer comes to you and says, am I eating a gene-edited mushroom? If you don't answer that question and you're Wegmans or Walmart, you've lost trust of that consumer. So you have to either be able to point them to information about that or be able to answer that question. So in my mind, you need some sort of registry, some sort of a place where this information is publicly available that different stakeholders can use to begin to address the issues that will arise in the marketplace from this technology. I think the side benefit of this is that, the more transparent you are, consumers are going to learn about this and be positive about it. But I do think that you need that out there. So what I've advocated is a national registry. You could have an international registry. It could be government, could be non-government. But I think you need some place that has accurate information about what's out there. The final point I want to make is, if you don't have that, the marketplace will set up its own registry. The organic movement will put that together, or the non-GMO project, I'm sure already has a list. And that list is going to be over-inclusive. And that's likely going to cause more kinds of problems in the marketplace. So better to have an accurate list that everybody can trust than to have a series of inaccurate lists out there that scare consumers or scare food companies, retailers, or others that end up hindering this market from going forward.
Thanks, Greg. Let's take, okay, 2 more quick comments. Greg's Neil and Jack, Greg's highlighting intersections of trust, transparency, trade, and regulation, right? All of those go together. Neil, react to that, please.
Yeah, in the paper that we published a year ago, we talked about registry with the idea of smallholder farmer benefits in mind. And, we did a lot of debate about that, right? For me, and also as an investor, I think the transparency issue is so important to minimize, risk and concern. I'm an advocate in general for the concept. How you implement is another story. But in general, I think it is a tool for transparency. It's a tool that, like other things, may not be consulted very often, and probably over time, as people get comfortable, right? Maybe it's never consulted by the average consumer. But in the early phases of technology adoption, knowing that it's available, you can check it if you need it. Those people who want to, as Greg said, right, it's available. But the devil, of course, in all these things is in the details. And from my perspective, from an investor perspective, you don't want to put encumbrances on particularly small companies who will therefore be the ones who are disadvantaged. A large company, a registry, yeah, you got to manage it, but you'll figure it out. A small company, it can be a real impediment to innovation. So who has a say in what's in the registry, right? How will the registry actually be used? Oftentimes these things can be misused. They can be misused in the sense of saying, well, if it's on it, maybe it's not safe. And it gets imputed to be not just about transparency, but about safety. Or it gets picked up in IP issues or something like that. So who has the say in what's in the registry? Who owns the registry? Who deposits information? When does it get deposited? There's a lot of issues to be thought through. I think they're all manageable, and I think it's probably a valuable tool, but it should be thought through very carefully.
Thanks, Neil. Jack, you know a thing or two about trade, so I just want to ask you to comment on all these linkages here.
Yeah. So one comment on transparency is that you can't be transparent after somebody has asked. You can only be transparent before they ask. And so, it will be too late when people want to know and you haven't, and the information's not there. An example for McDonald's, they spent a lot of time arguing over whether or not to put all their ingredients on the website, and they finally did, and nobody came and looked. And the executives were kind of annoyed that nobody was looking, and the college people were like, no, this is what you want. People actually feel very comfortable knowing it's there, and nobody cares to look at it. So I think sometimes we do worry a little bit too much. From a trade perspective, other countries are going to want to know what things are on the market in the United States, if those products are regulated in their country, or if they haven't allowed that product on the market. And so I think that there are, whether or not there's a publicly available registry is different from the question of whether or not that information has to be available to the government so that they can answer questions when trading partners say, hey, is this apple, gene edited? And the government says, I don't know. Well, they're not going to allow that product to come in, any of them. And so it could lead to trade disruptions if the government's not just immediately aware and able to. In most cases, they're going to ask for a certificate that says these products that we're importing are free of this trait. And if the government doesn't know, then don't be surprised if countries don't allow those products in. And so, I think that would be to the detriment of the sector if certain products were blocked. And so I think, we need to be working with other governments to coordinate to ensure that as products start to show up on the market, that we understand what that means for trade and our trading partners.
Thanks, Jack. Okay, I'm watching the clock here, and I'm going to give the chance for some questions after this next segment, so get those questions ready. We've talked a bit about engagement and transparency. We could have whole panels on any one of these. Let's talk about access, which was another one of the principles that Greg proposed, along with co-authors in the paper he referenced. Again, going back to our keynote this morning, Samantha Power, she talked about CRISPR and its potential, and she also said historically we haven't seen a lot of delivery of the benefit of these kinds of technologies to smallholders, and she focused on the investments that USAID is making and others in helping to ramp up capacity in Africa and elsewhere. So I want to tie together that earlier comment with our conversation on access and the diversification of who has access to the resources, who has access to the technology. Neil, what's going to be needed to make this successful, not just for U.S. farmers, but for anyone, and not just for farmers, of course, but
The consumer eventually.
our global society?
Yeah. I mean, I think for one, we talked about who develops products and where they're developed. I think it's really important that the landscape of governance and oversight and whatever other mechanisms are important to get to social license are appropriate for the level of technology deployed. And that way, small companies, large companies will all be able to use the technology. Every company is investing in their own technology, and so whether they license it or not may or not be that important because there's many routes to get to edits and edited products in the long term. But I think it is important that not only is IP broadly available, and there are mechanisms we talked about earlier for that, but that also capacity is developed and deployed and distributed, right? So, the CGIAR does use genome editing. It's at several centers, so there's editing centers in different parts of the world. I think it's important that we build up that capacity over time, transferring that capacity to NARS and other groups, right? As it gets further tested and developed, makes sense. I said earlier, it's not trivial to do it, but it's manageable. Many times, what a breeder really wants is, give me an allele, right? They don't want to be messing around with all the mechanisms and the molecular biology of creating the edits. They want the alleles. And so I can imagine, for example, the CGR creating hubs where you do the technology and then distribute into many different countries, right? The actual edited crops that are going to be deployed and then bred into final products. So I think certainly the CGR hasn't figured out all its areas. I'm my other hat on here for the CG. But I think the commitment to broad access, broad distribution is clear.
Mm-hmm. How do we make that possible?
Maybe I can add that we're a startup, right? And we're using tools from similar to yours from Broad and elsewhere, but also developing our own tools. And we're very much of the mind that the rising tide is going to lift all boats, and that we want to form partnerships to ensure more people have access to this technology. So an example of this, earlier this year, we sublicensed a technology to Tropic Biosciences, which again is another startup focused on some of these crops that haven't benefited from other forms of biotechnology, in this case, coffee and banana. And so they're using the tech to protect these important crops from diseases that are emerging. In early conversations, potentially, there's the potential to work with philanthropists to, again, ensure that this technology benefits as many people as possible.
Thanks. Other thoughts on access and diversification? Go ahead.
Neil talked about some of the developing world and some of the products that Tropic Biosciences is looking at are relevant to the developing world, and I think we just need to keep that in mind, that there are a lot of challenges that with better tools could be deployed more broadly. And the U.S. and Europe and other places, we will produce enough food whether or not we have these innovations. It's a question of using more pesticide or less pesticide, but we'll still have food to eat, and we can always buy it if we can't produce it. But in many parts of the world, we want to be able to skip over some of these. Just like with cell technology, we didn't have to have landlines that go into every community across Africa. There's an opportunity to address some of these problems that fit into the current food system without having to disrupt it. And you mentioned the Green Revolution, which is highly reliant on water and fertilizer and inputs and other things. And if we can decrease the amount of inputs that are necessary, then again, maybe we can begin to solve some of these problems in a way that's more culturally or locally relevant. And so I think making sure that there is an opportunity. And to that end, I would say that organizations like FAO and WFP and EFAD and CG and others are just really important, because it doesn't really matter what happens in the United States. It really matters whether these international organizations are interested in doing it, are allowed to do it, and if they do take advantage of that. And I know some of the conversations are still ongoing in Europe, but I think it will be good when countries like Europe and China and Japan and Brazil are able to come to some sort of a resolution about how these products should be regulated, because I think that will also make it easier for other countries to move forward. It's always challenging if the U.S. is supportive of technology and Europe is not. Even if countries can move forward without Europe's blessing, they may still worry about import markets and aid and other things.
Great, thanks, Greg. A quick note, and then if you just want to come to the central microphone here, we'll take a few questions, comments, and then kind of answer them collectively. So Greg, and then to you all.
So I might just add, I think that everybody's talked about the need for access, but I think with that is also the need for public investment in research here, because it's great that Pairwise is doing products that are going to help consumers, and other companies do that, but there are some kinds of research and some kinds of products that probably aren't going to be done in the private sector, and the American chestnut is an example of that. And I think that if we really want to see the societal benefits from this technology, we have to make sure there's that public investment, and then we can get those, whether they're orphan crops, whether they're small, whether they're conservation products or other things that out there that might not arise if we just had private investment. And so I see the access thing not just about the intellectual property, but also the need to really have a broad investment in this, and especially from the public sector, which obviously the CG is part of that.
Yeah, I just want to be clear, yeah.
Obviously the CG is a major part of that, but governments in the United States and others, we also need that, I think, if we are going to, because I think consumers care about that. They care that it's not just being used in the United States on a cornfield, but it's going to be used in other kinds of ways.
Thanks, Greg. So again, we've got a microphone in the center here. If you don't mind just coming to it, what I want to do so we can hear from more of you is we'll take a few questions, comments, a microphone right in the center. I'll jot them down, so keep them brief. Queue up, there we go. We're going to we'll take a couple few, and we'll get a few reactions, and we'll take a couple few. And then my understanding of the schedule currently is that the awards, the laureate celebration is starting at 5, so we've got the schedule on your agenda is not quite right, so we're going to give ourselves 10 minutes here before we wrap up. So if you can just say who you are, say again your question or brief comment, and then we'll hear a few, and then we'll go to the panel. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Gideon Henderson. I'm the Chief Scientific Advisor to DEFRA, the UK Government Department for Environment and Food. And I've been heavily involved in taking legislation through government on just this issue, which it's called the Genetic Technologies Precision Breeding Bill, and it will allow the sort of technologies that you're interested in, where CRISPR is used to mimic traditional breeding approaches. You might be glad to hear that we will have a register as part of that, which we mandated register. There was various views on the panel about that, but that's part of the bill. I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's been fascinating and learned a lot from it and heard a lot that I agree with. I've got a couple of questions. As part of developing our bill, we have polled extensively the public, and we have found that they are generally pretty supportive of the use of CRISPR for crop development, particularly if the benefits are spelt out when asking them, but in general they're beneficial, they're positive. I wondered to what extent you think that's because of the widespread use in the human health endeavour, particularly during the pandemic, and whether that helps change people's mind at all about technologies since the negative debates earlier. And then what we found is the public are also rather less positive about the application of CRISPR in animals and in livestock. And I just wondered if you might comment on whether, most of the conversation has been about crops, but of course we eat meat too. Do you think it's different for livestock relative to crops that you've talked about? Thank you.
Thanks, Gideon. So again, we'll take a couple questions and comments, and then we'll bounce around up here. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Sydney McMurray. I'm a second-year food science student at the University of, Pennsylvania, so Penn State. So my question is a little bit geared towards the student aspect on learning all sorts of things. As students, we're kind of warned about this, not warned, but informed that a lot of the US markets are pushing more towards clean label foods, non-GMO, pushing towards all these organic trends. And I'm just wondering if you guys are seeing this, have you seen this in your career in the past years? And how would you choose to engage with consumers who are even knowledgeable about the subject and just choose not to believe in the power it has?
Okay. Thanks, Sydney.
Hi, my name is Bimu Patel. I'm the director and professor at Vegetable and Fruit Improvement Center at Texas A&M University. My question is basically towards Pairwise. I think I enjoyed the seminar from your group, Mike from Texas A&M, when they visited recently to Texas A&M. On the human health benefits, while I like to increase some of these health promoting compounds in fruits or vegetables, but at the same time, when you draw the line that how much you have to increase, because there's a lot of controversies on how these compounds behave on the human health. Because always, like for example, beta carotene started as a good compound one time, and now if you provide that to some smokers group, it increases cancer. Same time, like high anthocyanin in tomato is developed recently and approved. I'm really happy to see those things. But what timeline? What is the draw line you make it? Like, what is the level we have to increase? Do you really need a lot of human clinical data, or just at the cellular level and in animal studies, you can decide on that?
Great, thank you for the question. Okay, let's take these last two if you can keep them quick, and then we'll, all great questions, so we'll try to cover them all.
Sounds good. I'm Alicia Hirschman. I'm a master's student at the University of Minnesota studying plant pathology. I previously worked at a company actually called Calyxt. You've probably heard of it. And during that time, we were releasing our high oleic soybean and then developing that into oil. I guess my main question is, I got a lot of questions when I was trying to help sell the seed to farmers and wondering what the feedback would be from consumers. How do you define the difference between GMO and gene editing? Because a lot of people were basically saying, well, gene edited, that means GMO, that's bad, right? So I guess that's my biggest question, is defining that difference and distinguishing it.
Great, thanks so much, Alicia.
Good afternoon. I'm Arif. I'm the founder and CEO of Farming Future Bangladesh, a science-based organization working for smallholder in Bangladesh. I have a question for the panelists. A few of them actually I know, but I want to ask that for many of the product genetically engineered, which we have seen in Asia and Africa, we don't have great political buy-in for those technology. And will gene editing have similar treatment, or if not, what might be the most tactical way to move ahead? Thank you.
Okay, awesome. All great questions. Okay, so I've jotted them down. We're going to kind of treat these as lightning rounds. Let's actually start with the question, GMO versus gene editing. How are you explaining that? Sarah, how are you talking to consumers about it? Go ahead.
Real short and sweet. It's different in the science, and it's different in how it's being regulated in many places, including the US. So that's the short answer. But essentially, I think Administrator Power actually did a great job of spelling out the difference this morning in traditional GM crops. We're introducing something new, and in gene editing, we're essentially making a subtle tweak to confer a preferred phenotype. So we wouldn't use the word phenotype in all audiences, though. But that's my short and sweet answer.
Great, thank you. Sarah, while we've got you, let's take the question that was directed to you about the drawing the lines on how you characterize nutrition benefits.
Yeah, so I think the important thing about the work that we're doing at Pairwise and the products that we've developed to date is we're not actually adding anything new. We're actually removing something to make what already exists more accessible. So if we take our greens, for example, the edited greens are a mustard green, popular in a lot of cuisines, right? But usually consumed cooked, because they have, in their raw form, a very pungent flavor that you couldn't consume a bowl of salad raw with that very pungent flavor. So we haven't added any nutrition to the greens. We've taken a nutritional green, we've removed the pungency, and now this green is accessible as a salad green, offering more variety and new offerings in the salad category. So it's not about introducing something new. It's about removing a barrier to a food that already is healthy and nutritious.
Great, thanks. Jack, tell us why you think consumers in the UK, or the public in the UK, may have been less positive on livestock. And I wonder if you also want to try out the question on, do you think that the pandemic helped in terms of people's general acceptance for crops?
I'll take that second one first. I don't think that it did. I don't think it matters, because when, in terms of medicine, you're sick and you're willing to take a risk in order to get better. This comes back to the prospect theory, Daniel Kahneman. But when you're not sick, you're not willing to take any kind of risk. And so I think it's not surprising that in general there's a higher concern about new technologies in food than there ever will be in drugs. I think in terms of animals, we do think about animals differently, and the reality is that there just aren't any products on the market that were genetically engineered animals, and so most governments don't really have paths for that. In the U.S., where we're the furthest ahead, it took 25 years to get the salmon, through a regulatory process, and so I think we're just at a much earlier stage in those technologies. In terms of just being able to articulate, what a benefit would be. The polled cattle, I don't think people understand what happens anyway. For the salmon, again, the challenges I think are a little bit harder. They're, the consumer benefits. Maybe, for some things like the tomatoes in Japan, there's going to be, and for the fillets of fish, but I think it's just going to continue to be more difficult to identify some of the easy consumer traits and benefits. Let's see, I think
We've got just a few minutes left, so we can circle back on last thoughts at the end. Greg, for you, the U.S. market's pushing towards green labels. Can you speak to that question?
Yeah, so I want to say that while I agree with Jack that it probably wasn't helped get consumer acceptance, the COVID issues, I think there's the potential that if something goes wrong with gene editing in the human drug area, that could have a big negative consequence. So I think you have to look at it. So you may not get a positive push to the foods from human applications, but if there's a negative issue that happens in human applications, somebody does gene editing and people are, get sick from it or die or something like that, that is going to have a big consequence. I think you have to be careful about that. I think, for clean labels and all these things, the key is to be honest with consumers. I think consumers are smarter than we think. And I differ a little bit with Sarah's view on the GMO versus gene editing. There are lots of different kinds of gene editing. And so, I think you have to be more specific. And I think you have to be honest with consumers about this. And the same thing around those clean labels. I think if a product is more sustainable and is gene edited, that may be helpful in that it may be a more clean label product. So I think the key here is both honesty and also having sort of defined standards. One of the problems with clean labels these days is, people are self-determining what is considered a clean label food. I think we need some more national standards on that. And once you have that, then I think some of these products may fall within them and consumers would find benefit from them.
Thanks, Greg. 2 questions left, one that was from the audience and then one from me to wrap us up. Neil, the question on tactical approaches for political buy-in as you think about developing world countries and maybe some of the countries you're working with through the CGIAR network.
Wow. Maybe that's an after the we're done kind of conversation, because it's very complicated. I mean, as genome editing is not something that the donors of the CGIAR want to endorse out of Europe, right? So how do you fund it? What's the political will to see those products? I mean, it's a very complicated conversation. So in the interest of time, maybe we could have a post-meeting discussion.
Great. Greg framed this all as an invitation to dialogue. Appreciate all the comments. Final lightning round, this is keeping it to just kind of a 30-second answer each, but in the spirit of the conference in general, asking for calls to action, what would each of you say is the biggest need or the biggest call to action if we're trying to secure societal benefits of gene editing?
Focus on benefits.
Focus on what?
Focus on benefits, right? I mean, the key is consumer care about certain things in their food. Focus on that. I mean, any conversation that starts with, "We got this technology and we're thinking of using it," is a dead conversation. So, and at the end of the day, it's about the benefits. I mean, you mentioned the case of medicine, right? You take any risk to save your life when you have cancer.
Yeah.
We're not talking about it for food, but there are benefits for how we produce our food. Focus on that, and the technology is an enabling way to get there.
Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah, I would say definitely focus on the benefits, and the challenges before us are enormous. It's been, they've been talked about a lot over the last couple of days, from yesterday's CCC panel to this morning. We absolutely need gene editing for the betterment of people and the planet, and that's we need to bring forward benefits. But I think, in addition to that, in order to get products that are diverse and serve lots of people and lots of communities, we need to build a vibrant and inclusive innovation environment, right? And we're only going to get the kind of benefits that we see if we have that kind of enabling environment. And then if we have very risk proportionate, science-based regulatory environments around the world, it's only then that startups like us and public sector organizations like the CG that are developing public goods are going to be able to use these tools to innovate, to ensure that this technology really does confer the societal benefits that are going to help nourish people and nourish the planet.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Jack?
People love innovation almost as much as they despise change. And there's no place that people despise change more than in the food they eat. And so understanding that's critical. If the Impossible Burger had been produced by Monsanto, it would have been looked at as change, and people would have said, why in the world are they trying to give me a GMO burger? Instead, Impossible Food brings it, and it's $25 a burger, and founding farmers in Washington, D.C., and rich people are lining up to buy it. So who brings the technology to market, to me, is more important than whether or not technology is involved at all. For the most part, consumers just don't care if the right person brings it to market.
Thanks, Jack. Greg, call to action.
I would say the two critical things. One, investment in public research. I really think you need that. I think we need, if this technology is solely brought by the private sector and they're all private sector products, I think there's going to be some part of the public that's going to be concerned about it. So I really think you need to have public sector research in this. And two, as I mentioned before, transparency. I think you need that for choice, for the markets to function, and to educate about the technology. So to me, those are the two critical things.
Great. Well, thank you to our panelists. Again, I think I've been honored to get to sit with you all to cover a whirlwind of topics in a very short time. We want to get you all to the laureate ceremony. So just join me in a round of applause, and feel free to stick around for dialogue after.
A lot of fun. This is good.